also published 5 novels under her pseudonym, Geneva Holiday. So would you please join me in welcoming Bernice McFadden to Austin.
Good afternoon. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Okay. I'd like to thank Evelyn and Rosalind for bringing me out. I think I tried to get here 2 or 3 years ago, and that was a whole big scene, and you can read about it on my blog. Anyway, I'm just going to give you some background about me. Is everybody here familiar with my work? Or am I new to you? Okay, so some people who have not read me. So I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. I still live in Brooklyn, New York. And I learned to read quite early. And my mother taught me for very selfish reasons. She worked a 9-to-5 job on Wall Street, and I had a little brother, about 3 years old. So she was so tired when she came home in the evening that she needed to take a nap before she cooked dinner. So she taught me how to read so that I could read to my brother while she napped. And unbeknownst to her, she opened up a whole other world for me. And I started reading voraciously. And when I ran out of my little books, my little nursery school books, and C. Dick Run and all those books, I started reading her books, the books she had hidden in her bureau drawer, the books she kept hidden under her sweaters. Harold Robbins, Jackie Collins. I was 8. And so I was very intrigued by that, because obviously, I wasn't living that life. I certainly wasn't having sex. And of course, I would keep the books in my room and dog ear the sex parts. But it was through those books that I decided that this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to do what those writers were doing, creating these fabulous stories. So around 9 or 10, I wrote my very first short story. My mother came home and I was so excited, and I was like, read this, please. And she needed to have her nap. I was like, no, please read the story first. So, she had her Newport in her mouth. I gave her the sheet, and she's smiling and smoking and reading and smiling and smoking and reading, and then that smile turned into a line, and that line turned into a frown because she got to the sex parts. And I was very unhappy. And so we had to have this long conversation. What do you know about this? Has someone done something? No, those books. And so I told her myself. But she didn't take the books away from me, because I came from a home that really did not censor. And she said, you can read these books, and if you have any questions, just come to me and I will answer those questions. And so that's how my writing career sort of began. In 1979, I went off to boarding school, St. Cyril Academy in Danville, Pennsylvania. And up to that point, I'm reading and I'm writing. My mother knows I'm writing, but these stories I'm keeping to myself. And I go to the school, which was all white, in suburbia, Pennsylvania. I was one of 4 or 5 black students. And they had a library with a lot of very old, very dusty books. And I tried to read them, but there were stories that I was not interested in. Up to that point, I was reading a lot of, again, Jackie Robbins, Harold Robbins, Jackie Collins, and Stephen King. And those books were not allowed in my school. So I went from an environment that did not censor to an environment that did censor. And so for about 4 years, I kind of stopped reading. I was turned off. I was still writing little stories just for me. It was when I graduated in 1983 that this idea of becoming a writer kind of reignited in me. And that was because I read The Color Purple by Alice Walker. I was 18 years old. It was the first book by a person of color I had ever read, and I was blown away. And what I thought at that moment when I closed the book was, I could do this. Here was a black woman who had not only written a fabulous novel, but she received the Pulitzer Prize for that novel. And I knew the book was important because even though I used to steal my mother's books, she was really not a big reader. But this book was dog-eared, and it had been passed around between her and her friends. And I knew it was important because when the movie came out, my parents went to see the movie together, and they never did anything together. That's how important this work was. And so I said, okay, I'm going to continue writing. I'm going to try to find a publisher, or at least get a short story published in a magazine. So from about 1983 up until 1988, I'm sending out my short stories to a variety of magazines, and I'm getting rejection letters or no response at all. In 1987, I wrote this poem called Sugar about this beautiful black woman who's in this southern town. It was only about 10 lines. And I was like, oh, this is cute, and I put it away. 1988, I gave birth to my daughter. And so now I'm this single mom, I'm living at home, and I feel like a statistic because I'm not doing what I really want to do, which is right. I'm working this job that, I'm just doing it because I need to eat and pay bills. And I made a decision at that point that I would completely commit myself to this thing that had been gnawing at me for so many years. In the same way, I was going to commit myself to being a mother. And so I started looking at all of the short stories that I had written. And the one story that jumped out at me was Sugar, because at this point I had picked up the poem and expanded it into a short story. And I remember reading in one of the many books that I have at home, and I'll call it like Writing 101, where the author says, it's virtually impossible for an unknown writer to publish a book of short stories, which is what I was trying to do. You have to start with a novel. And so Sugar would become that novel. So I worked on it, and I worked on it, and I have some of the drafts at home, and when I teach my creative writing workshop, I bring in the first few pages of those early drafts, and it's really bad. And I thought, I was like, why aren't I getting, responses saying, they want to, a publisher wants to pick this up. Now I know why when I look back. So in the meantime, I'm working in travel and tourism, and I'm writing, and the only reason why I was in travel and tourism is because I wanted to see the world, and that's where you go if you want to see the world for free. And then I enrolled in courses at Fordham University. Had never finished college. I graduated from high school, I went to college for a year, and decided it wasn't for me. So I'm taking classes, well, I should have been taking classes in business, because that was my idea. But let me go on ahead and get this degree so I can make some money, and then at some point, maybe I'll get published when I'm 50. But I wasn't taking business classes. I was spirited off to poetry and journalism and creative writing and African American history and African history, and I was just intrigued. And it was in my first creative writing class that my professor, her name is Professor Margaret Lamb, I remember her to this day. She had published about 3 or 4 books. It was her who took me aside and said, I don't know why you're not published. So that was confirmation for me that this idea I had in my head wasn't just some sort of fantasy. Here was someone who was accomplished, who believed that I had it in me to also become accomplished. So again, I started sending out query letters, one after the other, and I continued to work on my manuscript. And I knew the query letter was, really getting good when I started receiving personalized rejection letters. Someone who he took the time to write something. In any case, this went on for a number of years. And just when I thought that I was going to walk away from this novel, something really wonderful happened. In 1997, I was working as a customer service manager at Sunburst Holidays. And it was raise time. And my manager came into me and said, "Oh, Bernice, we're so sorry. We won't be able to give you a raise." And I said, "Oh, okay." And I went home and I thought about it, and I looked at this manuscript, and I thought about that job, and I said, "You know what, I have enough money saved. I'm gonna quit." And I went in the next day and I gave him my resignation. And then of course, "Oh, what do you want? We'll give you anything." And something in me said, "No, it's time to walk away." And so I left. And I was home for 7 months. And for 7 months, I worked really hard on sugar. You know that Bible story, is it 2 fish, 5 loaves? There was no reason the small amount of money I had in my savings account should have, lasted me for those 7 months. But it almost seemed like someone was slipping money into that account because I didn't change my lifestyle. I took my daughter out every weekend, and we did what we usually did. And I thought that was going to be it. I was going to be published, and I was going to win the Pulitzer, and that was it. So 7 months later, I think I'm down to $100 in my account. I've got this much hair growth, couldn't get my hair cut. And I have to go out and find a job. So I started sending out my resume and got a call from Goldman Sachs. And I went in, it was May of 1998. And my suit didn't fit because I gained weight. And I just looked bad. I know I looked bad. And I went in and I had this interview with 2 directors. And the whole time I'm sitting there, I'm listening to them, I'm answering their questions, but I know the expression that's on my face, that I don't want to be here. I think you're foolish. There's something better for me. Blah, 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 blah. And at the end of the hour interview, we shook hands. I said goodbye. I went home. I was like, I'll never hear from them. And I got home, and there was a message. "We want you to start on whatever day." I was like, really? But that's God's hand. So I started the job. It was a new department, so it wasn't really anything to do. But the wonderful thing was they had these brand new computers, a laser jet printer. You know what I was working on? I was working on an old IBM that I had to abuse to keep it going. I had to slap it around for it to keep going. And I had a dot matrix printer. Do y'all know how long it takes to print out 200 pages on a dot matrix printer? So in any case, I don't know, I probably answered the phone in this department 6 times a day. And the rest of the time was my time. So I emailed my manuscript to myself, and I worked on it there. And then I started emailing to agents and editors, and I'd print up my manuscript in 15 minutes. And oh, it was fabulous. I didn't buy paper for a year. And I felt it getting closer. I felt that moment coming, and I was really positive, and I just kept seeing myself in this position. February 9th, 1999, it's Alice Walker's birthday. It's also my daughter's birthday. And I sent an email to a literary agent named James Vines. And he responded, "I like what you said in your letter. Send me the first 3 chapters," which I did. Now, I didn't get excited because I had been doing this for a number of years. And I had done that, 3 chapters, the entire manuscript, and then there was always a no at the end. So about a week later or 2 weeks later, he came back. He said, "I enjoyed those 3 chapters. Would you please send me the entire manuscript?" And I did that. Again, I didn't get excited. Another 2 weeks went by, and I got a call. He said, "I really love the manuscript, and I'd like to take you on as a client." So I went in my suit, and we had a very nice conversation. And he looked at me, he said, "Well, you don't seem very excited." And I said, "Well, I know the stories. I know the stories about people who have signed with agents and 2 years go by and they still can't place their manuscript. So I'm not going to allow myself to get excited. 2 days later, I had a 2-book deal. 2 days after that, I went in and handed in my resignation. And that's the last job I held in corporate America. And I always said, this is it. I'm just going to go forward. This is my life. I ran out and I bought a house. I bought a car. And people are looking at me like I'm crazy. Like, what are you doing? As if you can't make a living as a writer. Now, it goes back to color. They didn't, just like myself, didn't see people that looked like me really making a living doing it. So how could I do it? But I was determined. So a few years go by, and there's a manuscript that I had in the drawer written under the pseudonym Geneva Holiday. And I had started writing that story, Groove was the first story, because I could not sell sugar. And because everybody kept coming back to me saying, there's no audience for this book. You should read what's out there, change up the story, and then come back. So I got so frustrated, I knew I would never change sugar, but let me try something else. Let me try to write what it is they want, write to the audience that was out there. So I had started this book, Groove, had about 60 or 70 pages, and I sold sugar, so I put it away. So in 2004, I think it was, I contacted my agent. I said, what do you think about this story? He said, oh, I like it. You should finish it up. Let's find a home for it. And just like that, I had a 3-book deal as Geneva Holiday. And it came in the nick of time because the literary books that I had been writing for a number of years were not selling in the way that my publisher expected them to sell. And so those contracts went away, and I was only writing as Geneva Holiday. And that was fine, because I know everything is secular. I needed a minute for the publishing industry to realize that we are not a people who are only interested in one type of story. But then the Geneva Holiday contract went away. 2008, the market crashed, everything changed. And so here I was, story with the Renaissance at its center. And I shopped this story around, and I have so many rejection letters. Mind you, I have 75 rejection letters for Sugar. I must have at least 40 to 50 rejection letters for Glorious. No one wanted to touch this story. I received rejection letters saying, Bernice McFadden's career is over. This is not the book to restart her career. And sometimes when you hear those types of things over and over and over again, you start to take it on, you start to believe it. But something inside me kept saying, no, just keep sending it out, keep sending it out. And so finally I started to send it to the independent publishers. And I was avoiding the independents because they don't pay any money. And I was used to my very nice advances. So I sent it to Johnny Temple, who is the owner and founder of Akashic Books in Brooklyn, my hometown. And I received an email from him saying, well, we only publish so many titles a year, but send it and, we'll see. And we all have to love it and, this whole hoopla. But I had said to myself, if I didn't find a publisher for this book by September of 2009, I was going to go on ahead and publish it myself. So that was April. July, we have the Harlem Book Fair up in Harlem, New York City. And I'm out walking around. I was supposed to speak. And I see this white man, this young white guy, and he's standing in front of a table, or behind a table, and there are books on the table by Elizabeth Nunez, who spoke earlier today. And I said, oh, and I hadn't seen Elizabeth in a while, and I had no idea that she had a new book coming out, and that was Anna in Between. And I said, oh, Elizabeth Nunez. And he said, yeah, you should come by and see her. She's speaking at 1:15. And I said, oh, well, I can't make that because I'm going to be speaking at 1 o'clock. And he says, oh, well, are you a writer? And I said, yes, I am. And he said, what's your name? And I said, Bernice McFadden. And he goes, oh, I'm Johnny Temple. Story with the Renaissance at its center. And I shopped this story around, and I have so many rejection letters. Mind you, I have 75 rejection letters for Sugar. I must have at least 40 to 50 rejection letters for Glorious. No one wanted to touch this story. I received rejection letters saying, Bernice McFadden's career is over. This is not the book to restart her career. And sometimes when you hear those types of things over and over and over again, you start to take it on, you start to believe it. But something inside me kept saying, no, just keep sending it out, keep sending it out. And so finally I started to send it to the independent publishers. And I was avoiding the independents because they don't pay any money. And I was used to my very nice advances. So I sent it to Johnny Temple, who is the owner and founder of Akashic Books in Brooklyn, my hometown. And I received an email from him saying, well, we only publish so many titles a year, but send it and, we'll see. And we all have to love it and, this whole hoopla. But I had said to myself, if I didn't find a publisher for this book by September of 2009, I was going to go on ahead and publish it myself. So that was April. July, we have the Harlem Book Fair up in Harlem, New York City. And I'm out walking around. I was supposed to speak. And I see this white man, this young white guy, and he's standing in front of a table, or behind a table, and there are books on the table by Elizabeth Nunez, who spoke earlier today. And I said, oh, and I hadn't seen Elizabeth in a while, and I had no idea that she had a new book coming out, and that was Anna in Between. And I said, oh, Elizabeth Nunez. And he said, yeah, you should come by and see her. She's speaking at 1:15. And I said, oh, well, I can't make that because I'm going to be speaking at 1 o'clock. And he says, oh, well, are you a writer? And I said, yes, I am. And he said, what's your name? And I said, Bernice McFadden. And he goes, oh, I'm Johnny Temple.